the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is episode 25, and today we have Dr. Tim Noakes joining us on the show. Dr. Noakes is the author of The Lore of Running, Waterlogged, The Lore of Nutrition, and many other books. He is also the developer of the Central Governor Theory. Dr. Noakes' most recent work is centered around diet and how humans can use nutrition to achieve optimal health. Listen to this episode to learn how the Banting or ketogenic diet can help increase your health, and learn if it is the ideal diet for cycling performance. Just wanted to make a general note at the beginning of this podcast to say that Dr. Noakes is located in South Africa and his internet connection isn't the best. So for some reason, our typical software that we use for the podcast was cutting out every 5 minutes on his internet. And I don't know why that was. Regardless, we had to use a new software to record the show. We got most of the show done well, but there are some minor breakups when either Dr. Noakes is speaking or myself are speaking. So just know that you should be able to get the major concepts of the show and most of it, but there will be a few breakups that you may hear in the editing. I just wanted you to know that because we take a lot of pride in trying to make the audio files as good as they can be, but know that there will be a few breakups in this episode. If you have any questions because of those breakups, feel free to write in and I will do my best to answer those questions for you. Thank you. So Dr. Noakes, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Chris.
Perfect.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on the show. This is a great honor to have you on the show. I think your teachings and thoughts have been on my bookshelf for a lot of years, and I'm confident that many of the people listening to this show can say the same thing.
Thank you.
So you're joining us from South Africa, right?
Cape Town, South Africa, right at the tip of Africa.
Wow, that's
quite a long way from you. Yes.
Yes, yeah, you may be the farthest guest we've ever had on the show, so that's very interesting. All right, so I certainly do not mean this in a disrespectful way at all, but in some ways, I think you have been known as the Lore of Running guy and the Central Governor Theory guy.
Yes.
But more recently, your passion and mission has been focused on diet, and more particularly, your teachings are centered on the fact that conventionally, dietary advice from the past 50 years is actually negatively impacting our health. And your mission is to educate and empower people to use correct nutrition as a way of taking control of their own health. Is that a pretty fair assessment?
I think that's a very fair assessment. It turns out that the trajectory of my life came to this. It had to come to, I didn't choose this, but it was just how it happened.
Okay.
And quite simply, my father had type 2 diabetes. Genetically, I'm prone to diabetes. I'm profoundly insulin resistant. I then started running in the period when we were promoting high carbohydrate diets. I promoted the high carbohydrate diet. I followed it. I developed type 2 diabetes. My dad lived with the disease for 10 years and then died. And it was a terrible death that he had. So when I was diagnosed, I realized I had 10 years to sort the problem out. And that sent me on this different pathway to discover what is the best nutrition for someone like myself.
Amazing. Wow, that's quite the story. Okay, so let's just get right into it. And nutrition has always been a really popular topic on this show, and a lot of people have asked about the ketogenic diet and all those things, and we haven't talked about it. But we're going to get into the details of your diet. But I say diet, but really it's a lifestyle change. Your lifestyle nutrition plan is referred to as Banting. So in its simplest form, can you describe what the Banting diet or lifestyle is?
Well, in its simplest form, the Banting diet is a low carbohydrate, higher fat diet. It's named after a guy called William Banting, who was a very obese Englishman who in 1862 wrote a book called Letters on Corpulence. And he had gone on the low-carb diet. He was the first person ever to go on this diet, and it was very effective. He lost 40 pounds in approximately 9 months, and then wrote this book, which then became the Bible for a weight loss diet. So it was the first low-carbohydrate diet, and that was the diet that was used for weight control right through till about 1950, when it was displaced, unfortunately, by this idea that the calories you eat, it doesn't matter whether they come from carbohydrates or fats or proteins, they're all the same. So as long as you're eating too many calories, you're going to get fat. So the Banting diet then is one that is low in carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates, sugars, and it replaces those popular foods, the refined carbohydrates, the cereals, the grains, the potatoes, the rice, the pasta. It replaces them with nutrient-dense real foods, particularly meat, fish, dairy, nuts, eggs, vegetables. That would be the basis for the diet. So it's no cereals and grains, no processed foods, no sugar, very little fruit, some vegetables, but the focus mainly on those foods that humans have eaten for millions of years, mainly animal-based foods.
Okay, very interesting. Now, you hear a lot lately about the ketogenic diet. Is the Banting lifestyle or diet similar to the ketogenic diet? And if not, how are they different?
No, absolutely. It's the basis. The low carbohydrate diet is the basis for the ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is just the most extreme form where you eat very little carbohydrate. So by and large, on a ketogenic diet, you wouldn't be eating any fruit and you would be eating relatively less vegetables because vegetables tend to have quite a lot of carbohydrate in them. So you'd be doing everything else I said, but you'd even be moving away from eating any vegetables, particularly potatoes and starchy vegetables. They would fall away because as soon as you increase your carbohydrate intake above about 50 grams a day, you go out of ketosis. So it's the extreme variant of a low carbohydrate diet.
Okay. And is a ketogenic diet something that you believe in or support, or do you not?
No, absolutely. I do support it for people who are metabolically sick like myself, who have type 2 diabetes. By the way, mine's in remission because I'm on the ketogenic diet. So it is really described for the people who are the sickest with the most insulin resistance. If you are healthy and your glucose control is good, you don't have to be ketogenic, in my opinion. It may well be that in the next few years, we'll discover that a ketogenic diet has additional advantages. And there's a lot of work being done now on what are the specific benefits of having higher ketone body levels.
Okay. So from a physiological perspective, how does the Banting diet cause you to lose weight?
Okay, the main way it works is by satiating you. So the problem we discover is that carbohydrates, particularly when they come in the form of processed foods with lots of sugar, are highly addictive and they make you very hungry, repeatedly hungry all day. So you might eat your breakfast, which has got a lot of carbohydrate and sugar in it. And within 2 to 3 hours, your blood glucose has risen and come down again. You've secreted all sorts of hormones that then cause you to start to be hungry again within 3 hours. And that's why you have to have tea or biscuits at 10 o'clock, and then you're hungry again at lunchtime.
Nice.
But when you eat a when you eat a high fat diet, what happens is that taking the carbohydrates out, you become satiated much more effectively. And you start to feel hungry 6, 7, 8 hours later. So the full outcome is that you reduce your calorie consumption. So I calculated that I reduced my calorie consumption by 33% when I went on this diet. And the key is you're never hungry. That's the key. How can you reduce your calories and not be hungry? Well, that's what this high-fat, higher protein diet does for you. So it's simply carbohydrates make you hungry, and particularly if it's processed foods, because they're designed to make you want to eat more of the same food. Okay. So that's how the processed food industry captured us and made us addicted.
So in the Banting Pocket Guide, you mentioned that the Banting diet works for most people, but not all people. So who does it not work for?
The people it doesn't work for are those who've got a serious sugar addiction and who really can't get rid of the sugar. That's, to me, a lot of people will tell you, obesity is because you're just eating too much and not doing enough exercise. It's not. It's because you're hungry, perpetually hungry. And the perpetual hunger is usually driven by the carbohydrates.
Okay.
So when you remove them, then you should get less hungry. Now, there are some people, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, because in some people, the fat stimulates them to continue to want to overeat. Oh. So that's one group of people. But generally, it's the people who can't get rid of the sugar addiction. So they might benefit for 2 or 3 months, and then they have a little bit of sugar, and whoops, back they start eating, and the weight comes back again. So
Interesting.
the key to this diet is you have to get rid of the sugar. Yeah.
Okay. So there are a lot of negative health side effects of this. So you mentioned insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, heart disease. There's a lot of things. And 420 million people, I think, in the world are insulin resistant. That was a stat from the book. So how does the Banting diet help prevent or even reverse these diseases? What is it doing?
Okay, so insulin resistance begins in your grandmother, in your mother's pregnancy.
Okay.
Sorry, in your grandmother's womb. And your grandmother eats a high carbohydrate diet, and she exposed your mother to a high carbohydrate environment. Now, glucose crosses the placenta, but insulin doesn't. So your mother was exposed to too much glucose coming into her blood, into her system. Okay. So she had to oversecrete insulin as a fetus. She's then born, and she's immediately exposed to a high carbohydrate diet if she's weaned onto cereals and grains. That makes her more insulin resistant. She then eats a high carbohydrate diet for 25 years, and then she falls pregnant with you, okay, or me. And she again, then, because that's what she's been eating, she also eats a high carbohydrate diet.
Wow.
And you are born with insulin resistance. So it's 2 generations is all you need.
Okay.
Now you also wean onto this high carbohydrate diet, and you start to oversecrete insulin. Especially for the first 30 years of your life, it's okay because you can cope. Your pancreas is still doing okay, and all the tissues are not fundamentally seriously insulin resistant. Okay. So when you eat carbohydrates, you secrete insulin, but the insulin takes the glucose out of the bloodstream, and you're okay. But then it starts to fail. The cells become more and more resistant to the entry of glucose. They become more resistant to the action of insulin. So you have to oversecrete more and more and more insulin. And that makes you more and more insulin resistant. And eventually, the pancreas, which is where the insulin is coming from, says, that's it, I can't do anymore. And then you develop florid type 2 diabetes. So like myself, I've got a pancreas now which can't secrete enough insulin, and it over-secretes the other competing hormone, glucagon. And so the only way I can regulate my glucose is by just eating no glucose whatsoever.
Interesting.
You cannot get any more glucose. Yeah.
So not everyone who eats a higher sugar diet gets type 2 diabetes. Is that a genetic thing, or what's happening there?
Correct.
Okay, so it's just genetics.
Well, I think it's genetics, but it's also how long you've been exposed. Okay, so how long you've been exposed to the high carbohydrate. So, for example, I would not have type 2 diabetes if I hadn't converted to a high carbohydrate diet. I was raised on a high-fat, high-protein diet because my parents were from Britain and they had eaten that way. That's the way the British ate. Yeah. And then I changed because I became clever and a doctor, and you were told to eat high carbs to prevent heart disease. Yeah. So that's exactly what we did. And after 33 years, I developed type 2 diabetes. But I've got data on myself. As a 28-year-old, I was profoundly insulin resistant. And that was my father. My genetics were there. But even if I'd eaten a low carb, I would never have known that. I wouldn't have developed type 2 diabetes. Okay. It's the combination of the bad genes and the high carbohydrate diet.
So for those who don't have the bad genes, does this type of diet make sense?
What makes sense is eating a diet of real foods and not highly processed foods. Okay. So the real foods, which again were the 5 or 6 we mentioned, the meat, the fish, the dairy, the eggs, and the nuts and the vegetables. Those are nutrient-dense foods. And so for little calories, you get lots of nutrients.
Nice.
The problem with the processed food diet is you get few nutrients and a lot of calories. And so you have to eat more and more calories to try and give you the nutrients, but you still don't get all the nutrients you need.
Okay. So for a long time, cholesterol has been this marker that everyone looks at. And in the book, you say that it really isn't the problem. And you also say that it's not a great metric to use for measuring your health. So can you talk a little bit about the misconceptions with cholesterol and why it's not a good measure for your health?
Okay, well, the idea that cholesterol predicts heart disease is the diet heart hypothesis. That's part of it.
Okay.
That Ansel Keys developed in the 1950s, that if you eat animal produce, particularly saturated fat, your cholesterol rises and the cholesterol clogs your arteries and you die of a heart attack.
Okay.
And that was never proven and it's never been shown. None of those components have ever been shown. So, for example, there's no evidence whatsoever that if I measure your cholesterol or my cholesterol, that I can predict how badly diseased your coronary arteries would be.
Really?
You can have a cholesterol value of 12 or like 350 and have completely normal arteries, and you can have a value of let's say 100 and have diseased arteries, completely
Really?
diseased arteries. Yeah, because it's got nothing to do with cholesterol. It's got everything to do with insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes is the predictor of arterial disease. And everyone knows that, but it's the elephant in the room. So if you go and look at the literature, the best predictor of heart attack risk, the best predictor of whether you're going to die once you've had a heart attack is whether or not you have type 2 diabetes. It is way above everything else.
Really?
Even if you have so-called familial, it's in the book, but it's absolutely true. And everyone knows it.
They just don't want to admit
we've
it.
been so brainwashed because there are a couple of reasons why. Because the American Heart Association has been so deeply involved in this miscommunication, or all the heart foundations around the world.
Okay.
They've been misleading people for 50 years. To admit it would be a disaster. So they're not going to admit it. But the evidence is abundantly clear. It's absolutely clear.
Wow.
And so, that's the first. Insulin resistance drives most of the common diseases that we call diseases of lifestyle. They're not. They're diseases of nutrition. So a person like myself who's got insulin resistance is at risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, dementia, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis. If you're a woman, PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and infertility, acne, the bang shoot, the whole bang shooting match.
Wow.
And that's absolutely. Who discovered it? A Dr. Gerald Raven at Stanford University in the 1960s. He started researching, and he said, "Oh my goodness, insulin resistance is a driver of all these diseases." And he also showed that if you cut the carbs, you reverse the condition. But he was scared. He didn't go the whole hog. He did clinical trials of reduced carbohydrate intakes. But because he was at Stanford, because Stanford was one of the centers for cardiology around the world, if he had for one moment said, "Listen, guys, you got to eat a high-fat diet," that was the end of his career. He would have been nailed by all the cardiologists at Stanford and in the United States. And he would have lost all his funding, and he would have been destroyed as a human being.
What a shame.
So he was clever. He said, He was clever. He said, insulin resistance is a real issue. It's caused heart disease, but you mustn't cut your carbs too low because then you're eating too much fat and you're going to die of arterial disease from too much fat. So he sat squarely on the middle on the fence.
Wow.
And sadly, that cost him a Nobel Prize. Because if in the 1980s he'd continued his research, he would have shown that a low carbohydrate reverses all these conditions. But he didn't. He was too scared. And so, unfortunately, he dies unrewarded. But anyway, the point is, he made the major breakthrough by linking insulin resistance to all these chronic diseases.
Wow. Okay, so that's very interesting. If cholesterol isn't the marker that we should be using, what is a better blood marker that we could use to determine our overall health?
Your fasting insulin. It's what your insulin is when you wake up in the morning. And if it's above 6 units, you're in trouble. And
really?
Virtually 10% of the American population will have a fasting insulin below 6. Yeah, and there are other. I mean, there are many. 10%. So there's a study out recently showing that only 12% of Americans have normal metabolic profiles. So in other words, 88% are abnormal. That's how widespread this condition is. Yeah. And if we actually just took insulin alone as the marker, because they didn't necessarily look at fasting insulin as the most important value.
Wow.
So to give you an example, my fasting insulin when I was running marathons, I was lean and carbohydrate loading, eating 400 grams or 500 grams of carbohydrate a day. My fasting insulin wasn't 6, it was 30. It was 5 times normal, 5 times normal. I was a walking time bomb. And if people can just get one message from this podcast is go and measure your fasting insulin, and I guarantee you it'll be above 6. And if it's above 6, you're eating too much carbohydrate.
Wow. Okay, so what's the easiest way to measure that?
You have to go, obviously, to a chemical pathologist. So your doctor needs to draw a blood sample, and then they measure the insulin. Now, most people will say, go and measure your fasting blood glucose concentration. The trouble is, I had a perfect fasting blood glucose, but my insulin was 5 times normal. And that's because my tissue was still responding to this high insulin. But to keep my glucose normal, I had to oversecrete insulin 5-fold. Wow. And you can't sustain that. Eventually, the system collapses. Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's get into some more specific sugar questions. My brother wrote some of these, and he's not here. So if I goof them up, just bear with me. But there's some newer findings that link sugar to type 3 diabetes. And I'm not familiar with type 3 diabetes. And they also link it to Alzheimer's disease. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, type 3 diabetes is considered dementia or Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And what they show is that glucose is important to the brain cells, but they need insulin to use that glucose. And so that the brain requires to be insulin sensitive in order for it to function properly and to metabolize glucose. And as you become more insulin resistant throughout the body, so your brain becomes insulin resistant. Ultimately, if you've got advanced dementia, your brain can't use the glucose it requires. But unfortunately, the only other fuel it can use is either lactate, so it means you have to go out and intensively exercise to get your lactate out, which is not happening, that's right. Yeah. Or else you have to have be in ketosis. And so there's really some interesting work showing that if you take people who have mild dementia and give them ketone bodies, they improve. They do not reverse the disease. They still have seriously marked dementia, but they can function at a better level. So there's at least some early evidence showing that you can't reverse dementia, but you can improve it with the use of ketones. And so the argument would be that the prevention of type 2 diabetes, the reduction of insulin by eating a low carbohydrate diet would make it less that you'll develop type 2 diabetes or type 3 diabetes, as it's called. So to protect your brain, you've got to keep your insulin as low as possible. And you do that by eating
and that's because the excess insulin with your brain doesn't allow the glucose to work properly. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, we got you back. So because of the excess insulin and your brain's requirement to use glucose, there's too much insulin, which affects the brain's ability to use the glucose properly, which causes the dementia or Alzheimer's.
Yeah, you become increasingly... So I think I need to make this point, that the more insulin you secrete, the more insulin resistant the tissues become. It's like anything, the body adapts. So like antibiotic resistance, if you take antibiotics, the bacteria ultimately become resistant. In a similar sense, as you oversecrete insulin, you become more and more resistant. So you need more and more insulin. And that's what happens in the brain.
Okay.
And eventually the system shuts down.
So with respect to refined sugars, where do you draw the line? For example, a lot of people will use honey or maple syrup as a natural substitute for sugar. But is that, in your opinion, a refined sugar and causing the same ill effects of other sugars?
Absolutely. So I'm an extremist, and I say you can't have sweet taste. You've got to get rid of all sweet taste. Okay. And by supplementing with sugar replacements, they're just the same thing. You'll just keep looking for sugar.
Okay.
So you have to get rid of the sweet taste completely. That's the crucial thing.
So honey, in effect, is bad for your health. Would it be fair to say that honey and maple syrup would be bad for your health?
Okay, again, it's the individual is important. And
Okay.
if a person is fully insulin sensitive and that's the only carbohydrate they're eating, no problem.
Okay.
But if you're adding that to a diet full of rice and potatoes and bread and cereals and cornflakes and orange drinks and cola drinks, no, not
Okay.
acceptable.
Understood. Okay. And then the other recommendation for daily refined sugar intake, my brother read that it's 30 grams for men and 18 grams for women. Is that a good guideline, or you're just saying cut it all out?
It's got to be zero. That's the
Zero.
only safe amount of sugar is zero.
Zero.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, let's get into switching to a Banting diet from a regular diet. So by adopting a Banting or ketogenic type lifestyle, we're literally changing the energy systems that our body uses to fuel itself. We're changing from a sugar burning engine to a fat burning engine. So how long does that process typically take?
I think it happens very quickly. Louise Burke did a study on world-class race walkers, and she had them do a clinical test they raced 25 kilometers at race pace, and she showed within 3 weeks they had adapted almost completely, not in performance terms,
Yes.
but metabolically. Metabolically, they had adapted, so they were burning an enormous amount of fat and almost no carbohydrate when racing at their race pace. So she makes the point that their performance was impaired. That's acceptable. The performance probably takes longer than 3 weeks. It may take months. We've worked with some elite athletes who only start to improve really after 6 months or so.
Wow.
But for most people who are not world-class athletes, within 6 weeks, you'll see the major difference. In my case, it was stunning. Within 6 weeks, I saw dramatic changes. It was like
Really?
I was reborn as a runner. That's how dramatic it was. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. We'll get into the athletic side a little bit later. So,
Yeah.
so one part of the switch is known as the keto flu. People typically go through it, and you really get flu-like symptoms: nausea, vomiting, headaches, etc. What happens with the keto flu? Why does it happen? And what can people do to manage the symptoms?
I suspect it's mainly sugar withdrawal and carbohydrates, probably grains. Many people believe that grains and sugar are addictive. So I think the evidence that sugar is addictive there's no debate. It's
Right.
absolutely one of the most addictive products. Whether there's such a thing as grain addiction, maybe that's a little bit more difficult. Now, I was speaking even this afternoon to David Perlmutter, and he's the one who wrote The Grain Brain. And he believes that that grains are absolutely addictive. So if that is the case, you remove them, you go through this period of withdrawal. And that's, in my view, is what's happening. I never went through it because I was probably already diabetic, and I started feeling better immediately that I reduced the carbs.
Really? Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as far as ratios go for someone who's starting this type of diet, what is a good starting place for fat, protein, and carb ratios? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yeah, I didn't hear a word.
Yeah, perfect. So as far as the ratios go for a Banting type diet, when starting, where is a good place for people to look at fat, protein, and carb ratios?
Okay, we don't tell people how much proportion they should eat. What we do is say, start reducing the amount of carbohydrates. So let's say that if you're an athlete, you might have been eating 400 grams of carbohydrate a day, and we want to get you down to 120, below 100. So there are a lot of ways of doing it. A lot of people go cold turkey. They go right down to 100 and they feel terrible. Better way probably is to cut by 50 to 100 grams over 2 or 3 weeks, and then cut another 50 to 100 grams over 2 or 3 weeks, and slowly reduce. That's one way of doing it. And I think then my key is that you need to find that balance for where you feel comfortable and your exercise performance is good. And that's the lowest value, and you stop at that value. Some people that they go below it, their performance goes very poor and they feel terrible. So I've seen people go from 400 grams to 25 grams and aren't able to get out of bed in the morning. and then we push them back to 100 and they're fine. Yeah. I mean, that's how weak you can feel.
Okay.
So it's this is a process. It might take you 4 years to get to 25 grams a day if you have type 2 diabetes like myself. It may take a long time.
Okay.
It's a gradual process.
Okay.
But the other point to make is that if, let's say you've got an overweight problem, and we cut from 400 to 200 grams, nothing happens. If you're seriously overweight, you've got to get way down to about 50 grams. And the reason is quite simple. You've got to get your insulin down because the insulin is preventing burning fat and mobilizing fat. What was interesting in Louise Burke's study was that these athletes within 3 weeks had converted burning fats. And in a sense, I think what happened is actually that's a natural state. The natural human state is to burn fat. But if you eat carbs all the time, you've got high insulin, and that inhibits this process.
Okay.
You just take the insulin brake off and you start burning the fat. So that's why. And the people who are most sensitive to that are the ones who are really obese. Okay. So they've got to cut their carbohydrates way down to 50 to 25, and then they see dramatic results.
Interesting. Okay. Some people feel bloated when they start a Banting type diet. Why does this happen, and what can they do?
Well, that's really interesting because I don't understand that, because bloating is caused by the degradation of cellulose or the fermentation of cellulose in the gut.
Okay.
So it may well be that they still are eating too much vegetables. I can't explain it.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense.
All
because
right.
Bloating is specifically related to the fermentation process that cellulose goes through when it's in the large bowel.
Interesting. Okay. How about alcohol? Can you drink alcohol on this diet?
Okay, depends how healthy the same. If you're really obese, you must cut the alcohol because alcohol drives calorie consumption, in my view. So we tell people, okay, why don't you get to the weight you want to be, and then you can reintroduce alcohol. And if your weight goes up 5 kilograms and you're happy with it, fine. If it's not, if you want to be that low weight, then stay off alcohol.
Okay.
But I'm a teetotaler, so I can't really advise because I have a bias to thinking that there are not too many benefits to drinking alcohol. It's not a religious position. It's purely, I don't think that it necessarily helps your physiology.
I'm the same way. Not a religious thing, but I haven't drank for 20 years and I'm 37. So do the math on that. How about whey protein? Is that an option? No,
I don't think so. I think that you need to eat good protein.
Okay.
And the good protein is from animals. I mean, that's the debate. I know, many vegetarians and vegans will be listening to the show, and that's fantastic. And if you have it on religious grounds, perfect. That's fine. The clear evidence is the ideal protein is animal protein for it's what we've always eaten, and it's what your body's designed to work best with.
Okay. So my next question was, can vegetarians ban? But I think you just answered that.
Well, they can actually. There are vegetarian, but it's very difficult because you've got to eat a high-fat diet, and it's really difficult. It comes from avocados and palm oil. And, I wish all vegetarians would eat eggs and fish because that will make them extremely healthy. It's an extremely healthy diet if you've got fish and eggs combined.
Okay.
But if you're not eating any animal protein, it's a real problem.
Interesting.
And also you need the specialized fats, which also you in high concentrations in animal produce. The very few vegetables that provide you omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for brain function.
Okay. So in the book, you mentioned that breakfast is for some people and not for others. Why is that?
Yeah, I think the old idea that you must eat 3 times a day is nonsensical. Humans can't have evolved like that. We used to kill animals and eat them, and then when the food became available again, we'd re-eat. We're eating every 3 hours or 5 hours. It's nonsensical.
Okay.
If you are insulin resistant like myself, I believe your fasting is really helpful, intermittent fasting, and eating 1 cooked meal a day and then is probably best. So you could have breakfast, but then you don't eat till dinner and you just have a slight snack for dinner. Or conversely, you have lunch and then maybe you eat breakfast the next day. So those are the combinations. You can have breakfast and dinner, or or lunch and breakfast the next morning. And that's what I oscillate between those two. So, but the key is not really whether when you're eating, it's what you eat. And the diet that we advise to eat lots of cereals and grains and sugar for breakfast is a total disaster, because that sets you up for repeated eating of the same addictive foods.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I want to talk about athletes and all of that, but first I want to talk about individuality. And in the book, you say that several times that each person is unique, and our nutritional needs and the amount of carbohydrates that we consume on a daily basis varies from person to person. So can you talk a little bit about how our nutritional needs and our carbohydrate requirements vary from person to person, and how we know what type of person we are?
Yeah, that's great. And I think the point is that you can read all the literature you like, and I can tell you 100 studies all showing that humans need this or that or the other, but you are the individual. And I cannot prove that you follow exactly the same pattern as the majority of athletes.
Okay.
So the only way you can do it is test for yourself. You have to test for yourself. So the rule number one is that what I wrote in Law of Running is wrong, because it says you must all eat, everyone must eat this high carbohydrate diet. That's nonsense. So you do not, and you don't need as much carbohydrate as we were suggesting. If you go back to the Tour de France in the 1980s, athletes were eating 1 kilogram of carbohydrate a day. Now, what that's doing to your pancreas and your insulin secretion, I hate to think. I'm surprised that these guys remain healthy.
Okay.
If you exercise 6 hours a day, it's probably okay to eat 1 kilogram of carbohydrates. But that's only people who can get away with it, but they better be insulin sensitive. So we know that you can cut carbs. I don't think any athlete in any sport needs more than 200 grams of carbs a day. That's it. Maybe in the Tour de France, if you might need 50 grams of carbs an hour for 6 hours. So that might give you 300 grams.
Okay.
That, even if you're fat adapted, I allow you to eat 300 grams during the day. But that's it. And that's 6 hours. A guy playing a soccer match, or in our country, rugby is very popular, or running even a marathon, they don't need that much carbohydrate. A few hundred grams, that's all you need.
Okay. Interesting.
And you'll do very well.
Okay. So I think one of the...
So what we're saying is the idea that more is better. So the idea that more is better is wrong. And what we're saying now is actually find the least amount of carbohydrate you need to perform your optimum. That's the sweet spot that you're looking for.
That's a good way of looking at it. I like that. Yeah. Okay. So here's the key, the big question. Can a cyclist attain optimum levels of performance on a Banting type diet?
I suspect, well, we don't have the data.
Okay.
So I have to admit that immediately. However, let me give you a bit. Let's take the extreme, and then we'll come back to this one. If you are racing an Ironman triathlon, there's no doubt that you will do best on a high-fat diet. Why? Because it's consistent work rate, and you don't have to. In the run, you're going to run at the same speed. You're not going to speed up, and it's not a sprint against the other guy. It's the guy who's still running well at the last kilometer who's going to win.
Right.
In the Tour de France, the problem is the work rate goes up and down, and that's what we can't predict. So we can't predict what's going to happen after 5 hours if you haven't eaten any carbohydrates. Personally, there are some they need to control their weight, and they find that on this diet they can lose 5 or 6 kilograms. And Chris Froome's a classic example. He's dropped his weight by 7 kilograms eating this low carbohydrate diet. He still takes carbohydrates during the race, and on certain days he will eat more carbohydrate if he's doing high intensity exercise. So for him, he wouldn't win the Tour de France if he was purely on a Banting diet. He has to supplement with carbohydrate. And I think that would probably be the majority. But we're talking about a sport where where the activity goes up and down, and where in the last hour you've got to be cycling at 60 or 70 kilometers an hour.
Right.
And that might not be possible on a purely Banting diet. But you only get into that position if you're by 6 kilograms. So if your body weight is 6 kilograms because you're eating a high carb diet, you're not going to get there. So I think that's probably, if you spoke to the Sky people, they would tell you that. But they're reluctant to tell you to the extent to which they're eating a higher fat diet. They don't want that to be done. Yeah. Because
So that leads a little bit into what adjustments would an endurance athlete potentially have to make to a baseline diet? So you take a guy who just wants general health, he works out 3 times a week for an hour a day and does a desk job. Then you take a lot of our listeners are riding 10 to 20 hours a week. So how do they adjust for that extra workload?
Okay, 10 to 20 is an hour and a half a day, or up to 2 hours. I think we'd have to cut that. So the first guy is very simple, no problem. They will do very well on a no carbohydrate diet.
Okay.
And we've got a paper in press it's being reviewed at the moment, showing that your average runner can perform high intensity exercise on this diet. That covers the majority. The 90% of athletes can do very well on this diet that do not need carbohydrates. So we're dealing with the 10%. And who's that 10%? It's the more elite athletes. I understand running. So if you were running 2 hours, 45 minutes or faster, that might be you'd benefit from a bit more carbohydrates. So let's say from 2 hour marathon to 2 hour 45, you may well need a bit more carbohydrates. But once you go beyond 3.5 hours, no, you do very well on a high fat diet. So that again, remember, is a constant work rate.
Right.
And it's going up and down, that's more difficult. And certainly at the highest level in the Tour de France, these guys do need carbohydrates. But let me just make the point that sugar is a drug. And I suspect that a lot of the effect that these guys get from taking during a race is a mental stimulation. And particularly if you've been out there for 20 odd days, you need a bit of mental stimulation. So instead of taking coffee, you take your sugar. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any good literature out there that listeners can read to learn about that, the little excess that you take if you're going over threshold constantly back and forth, and you do need a little bit of carbohydrates. So you're a crit racer or you're not at the steady Ironman pace. Is there anything out there that people can read?
Well, Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek have written a book. I think it was the Art and Science of Low Carb. That's probably one of the best books. There are one or two others, but that's the one that I've kind of promoted as being pretty good. Yeah.
I'll have to read that. Okay. So we had Stacy Sims on our show, Dr. Stacy Sims. I don't know if you know her, but she is a nutritionist that's worked with a ton of pro tour teams. And her general recommendation was Dr. Weil's anti-inflammatory diet. Are you familiar with that diet?
I know Dr. Weil quite well. I mean, he's been around longer than I have.
Okay.
I'm not sure to what extent. Not sure to what extent he's low carb. So I'm not sure to what extent he's a low carbohydrate diet.
Okay.
And I'm also not sure to what extent the diet's been studied scientifically.
Okay. So then I guess if you don't know that, it's going to be hard to answer the question. But because we had Stacy on previously, I thought it would make sense for you to compare the two diets if you are familiar. But since you're not, we'll leave it at that. You still there? Oh, we got you back. Okay, perfect.
I didn't hear anything. There was no question. I didn't hear any of that question.
Oh, basically what I was saying is I was going to have you compare the two diets, but since you're not really familiar with it, that's not a fair question. So we'll leave it at that.
Let me say, if I don't know Dr. Weil's diet. It means it's not mainstream. It's not one of the ones that is hitting the headline, so to speak.
Okay.
If you ask me about Dean Ornish's diet or other people like that, so yeah, and I can say it's not been studied scientifically.
Okay.
And the other point is that it really comes down to the carbohydrate content and whether you're insulin resistant or not, because it's very clear that if you're insulin resistant, you can't eat a high carbohydrate diet. You've got to cut the carbs. So even if you're eating healthy carbs, they're still going to be too much for you. So Dr. Wild's, it would be fine, provided it's low carbs for people with insulin resistance, then it's a good diet.
Okay. What advice can you give endurance athletes who are switching to a Banting diet? So they're going to go through the low carb flu. They're going to have some hard times, probably in the early stages with training intensities. What advice can you give to those athletes?
Yeah, I think that you have to have a reason to change, and the best way would be if you had a medical condition like I had. Then there's no question, you have to change.
Okay.
The problem is for people who are lean and athletic and they're insulin sensitive, it'll be more difficult for them to feel benefit from changing. So the only argument I would say is that the probability that you'll become more insulin resistant with age is probably there, point one. And point two, a high-fat diet of real foods is a nutrient-balanced diet. It gives you the best nutrients for the least calories.
Okay.
And that's what you're really looking for. You're looking for a nutrient-dense food. So the diet's it's just a better diet for you to eat. Okay. And if you can get off all these processed foods, you're going to benefit in the long term. So it's worth sticking with it, even if you feel bad for 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
And so even if your performance doesn't change, if it doesn't change, it's a better diet.
Okay. So it's really, you're saying just kind of tough it out in that low carb flu phase. Just deal with it. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only reason I would not change is, let's say if you were doing blood tests and they showed some very strange abnormalities, or if you really couldn't adapt to it, if your performance just goes worse and worse and worse, and then when you increase your carbohydrates a bit, you feel better, then that tells me that you're one of those unique individuals for whom the diet doesn't work. And we can't explain it. But there are some individuals who really struggle once they go below 100 grams. But again, 100 grams is fantastic. It's much better to eat 100 grams of carbs a day than 500. So you're already, 100 grams is a low carb diet, and you'll benefit from it. Your health will benefit.
Okay.
Even if it's not as low as maybe I would like you to eat.
So that's a really interesting point, because I tried this type of diet, I would say 10 years ago. I forget how long, but it was a while ago. And I've always had perfect blood levels. Markers are always within range. Everything's good. And when I went on this diet, I had levels off the charts in many categories. So I stopped. And you just mentioned that some people have those types of issues. Do you know what causes that?
No, what will happen to you? So now we've got the Verta Health study, which let's not be technical, but it was a low carbohydrate diet for diabetics, and they showed that 24 of 20 improve on this diet.
Okay.
The one that doesn't improve is cholesterol. Cholesterol can go up, and that's what frightens people. So the fact that they just ignore the other 24, which means you're healthier, and they say your cholesterol's gone up, that's bad. But there's no evidence for that. The fact that your cholesterol rises on this diet does not prove that it's a bad diet. So by and large, most of the parameters will in fact improve. But if your cholesterol goes up, and 5 years ago you would have been told you're a heart attack waiting to happen, and so you would have been advised.
So I had issues with liver. But, go ahead.
Yeah, now that's surprising, because this is the diet that reverses fatty liver. Because fat doesn't make fatty livers, carbohydrates and sugars make it fatty liver. And that's where we got it all wrong. If you want to reduce all your risk factors, and particularly, for example, saturated fat in your bloodstream comes down when you eat more saturated fat, because that's being produced by the liver, and the liver chooses not to make saturated fat if you're eating a higher saturated fat diet.
Okay, so I had pre-warning signs of fatty liver and all these enzyme issues. You're saying that's not normal? Did you hear that?
No, sorry,
Okay.
I didn't hear that.
So one of the markers that were off for me were my liver enzymes, and I was showing signs of like a fatty liver disease. That's not typical.
No, I would argue that you were still eating too much carbohydrate then. If you combine carbohydrate, high carbs, and a high fat diet, that's the setting. Excuse me. I'll repeat that.
Yep.
If you combine a high carbohydrate and a high fat diet, that's the setting for fatty liver. But
Okay.
you don't cut the fat out the diet, you cut the carbohydrates and the sugar. So it may be that your diet, you still weren't quite eating a diet that was low enough in carbohydrate, and you were still eating some sugar, maybe some fruit. Because the evidence is clear that it's the sugar component that's causing the fatty liver.
Okay, perfect. So for athletes who switch to this type of diet and they go out and do a long 4-hour or 5-hour ride, or they're doing an Ironman, what type of food should they be consuming during training and racing?
Water, water, water.
That's it?
That's it. Yeah, the idea, listen, I and a few South Africans are accountable for the idea that you have to eat when you're racing. You don't. If you're fat adapted, you've got so much energy in your body. You do not need anything else. Yeah. So, but you have to train for it. So what do? You go out for your long cycle. You do an hour with just by water. You don't have breakfast, and you find you can do it. Then you do 2 hours. Then you do 3 hours. Then you do 4 hours. Eventually, you'll get up to 6 or 7 hours, and you'll be amazed how easy it is. So the only exception is when you get to 8 or 9 hours, maybe you can have a little bit of sugar to give you a lift in your brains, but you don't need it.
Wow.
Biologically, but yeah, if you're properly adapted, you don't really need the carbs.
Okay.
Because you've got a liver that's producing all this glucose. It's got this huge capacity to produce glucose, and you simply train it to do that.
Okay. So water.
So water. Let me make the point that I agree. If you're a guy trying to win the Ironman, then you metabolically you're superior. You can cope with a bit more carbohydrate, and the carbohydrate may give you a lift in your brain, and it may benefit your performance. But for the guy who's doing 16 hours, who's overweight, who's a little chubby, who's insulin resistant, no, the best thing you can do is run the Ironman on water, because your health's going to be better for it.
Okay. Electrolyte obviously has to be in there too, right? Sodium replacement and things like that?
Nope. So you need to read my book, Waterlogged, which describes why.
Okay, I got reading to do.
No sodium. Yeah, you got to go and read Waterlogged.
All right.
Yeah,
okay.
And you might just also go to the CrossFit website, and you'll see I've got 12 blogs on the during exercise and how we were misled by the scientists who were trying to sell a product to us. Yeah, and that product was a sports drink, whose name will remain infamous, and we won't mention it.
Yeah, well, I know what that is.
But, yeah, you have. If you read Waterlogged and you read the series on the CrossFit website, you'll see how we got misled to thinking that you have to have lots of carbohydrates.
I will look at that, but one question. What about cramping? What's going on there?
Cramping is a marker of fatigue. That's what it really is. So my colleague, Dr. Schwellnus, did some fantastic studies. So we first said, okay, are you low in sodium? And are you dehydrated? No, none of the guys with cramps were. What was clear was that they were over pushing themselves, that they'd estimated that they could run faster than they actually did. And when you looked at that, it seemed that the fact that it was fatigue, and they'd overestimated their abilities. So it's, in a sense, it's a protective mechanism, because it gets you to stop running before you injure something. That's the other factor. You may have an underlying muscle problem that the body's trying to prevent you from happening.
Okay.
I must say, however, that when you go on this diet, cramping does increase. And Steve Finney said years ago, you have to increase the salt intake. And if you read Waterlogged, it gives you all the science of why you never need to take salt, except it's very clear if you're eating a high-fat diet, you do need more salt. So I'm wrong on that one.
Okay.
But it does seem specific they need more salt, and that it does help you. And part of the keto flu may also be because you're becoming salt depleted and water depleted, and you may need to supplement with salt, and then you'll retain more water.
Okay.
So to answer your question, cramps are largely due to overreaching. You're doing more than your training allows you to do, and racing too fast. But if you're on the high-fat diet, yes, definitely, there's something to do with electrolytes, and supplementation with salt and perhaps magnesium may help you.
Okay, perfect. All right, we got a few left, and then we're going to ask you the famous Watt Point question. But let's start with some special considerations for typical people or certain people. So if you're gluten intolerant or have celiac disease, I'm assuming this diet is a great option.
Yeah, absolutely, because you got rid of all the cereals and grains, which where the gluten is.
Okay,
so it's
perfect.
the ideal. And let me just say that there's another condition, non-celiac gluten intolerance, which is widespread. For me, I used to have sniffles all the time. I used to have migraines, and I had reflux, and all linked to the condition. So it's a celiac condition related to gluten, but it's so minor that you ignore it and you think this is aging. And that's what I thought. Once I cut the gluten, my health improved dramatically. So for all those minor aches and pains, just think you might be gluten intolerant, but not enough gluten intolerant to develop celiac disease.
Interesting. Okay. What about those who are on medication for cholesterol, diabetes, depression, all these things? Can they bant? And if they feel better, can they stop taking their medications?
Okay, they definitely can bant, because all the conditions you described are insulin resistant related and related to diet, even depression. Depression is beginning to realize it's got something to do with nutrition and the gut flora that you've got. So you need to improve your gut flora. So all those conditions may be nutritional, and they may benefit from the Banting diet plus the supplements with fermented foods and bone broth. And kefir and those sorts of things, and sauerkraut, which may improve the gut flora. And, I get remarkable letters every day, people reversing all sorts of conditions, and the mental conditions are coming to the fore at the moment. So people are dramatically. They may not reverse depression, but they feel a whole lot better.
Okay.
The answer for that is never been proven to do anything for you. The benefit for a statin is 1 in 125 people if you've had heart disease. If 1 in 10,000 will benefit from the drug. So why would you? It's 1 in 10,000. Obviously you wouldn't. But as a doctor, you shouldn't be these drugs if they're only helping 1 in 125 people.
Right.
So the statins have very little use. Your blood pressure can not be able to get rid of those medications, and it's important because if you continue to take your blood pressure medications when your blood pressure is dropping on the diet, then you may fall, you may faint as a consequence. Diabetes is a condition. You can put the disease into remission, and some people reverse it. I'm in remission. I still need to take some medications for it, but not insulin. And that's what we call that remission, when your glucose control is perfect, but you're using some minor medications. But a large group of people reverse their diabetes. And the treatment for diabetes, the goal of treatment of diabetes is remission or reversal. And you can only do it by one of three things. You can either have bariatric surgery, which I wouldn't prescribe, or fasting, or a very low energy diet, but that's unsustainable. The only one that's really sustainable is a low carbohydrate diet. Grams a day, and it's remarkable. So and we have to get that message out, that if you have diabetes, it's not a death sentence. You can put it into remission, and you should have a long and happy life as a result.
Perfect. Okay, and then how about women who are pregnant or breastfeeding? What does it work for them as well?
Absolutely. Remember what I said?
Yeah,
your
grandmother
determines your insulin resistance, and your mother determines the insulin resistance of the next generation.
Okay.
And there's so much evidence that the less carbohydrate you eat, the less likely your child will be your fetus or the baby will be born insulin resistant. and the less likely it will become obese and diabetic in due course.
Okay. All right. So we ask a question to all experts on the show at the end of the show, and it's called the Watt Point question. And I know you have a running background, so we may just use percentages as a basis. But the idea is, if listeners follow all of the advice given by the expert, how much can their performance improve? So for cyclists, if they go from a really poor diet, high in carbohydrates and sugars, and then go to a really healthy Banting type diet, what type of improvement do you think that they could see?
Sorry,
I cut out
right at the start. It cut right at the start. I heard the last paragraph, but so you'd have to go all the way back to the start.
Okay, no problem. So basically, the premise of this question is, if the listeners take all of the advice given by the expert, how much of a performance improvement can they see in their cycling? So it could also apply to running. So we'll just use a percentage. So if you take a poor diet, high in sugars and carbohydrates, and you switch that athlete to a healthy diet and nutrient-dense foods like a Banting lifestyle, what improvement would you expect to see?
It depends on the athlete and the level of insulin resistance and the level of obesity.
Okay.
So that's the issue. That if we go back 30 or 40 years, everyone was thin, and the standard was quite different than it is today. Go and look at the films of Woodstock, the great music festival. Everyone there's lean, and no one was running the marathons or going to the gym.
Right.
And that's what people should look like. We should look like athletes. But when I go to a cycling race, I see 20% of the population look like athletes, 80% look fat. And they've got to be more objective about this. If you can pinch your tummy and you can feel a roll, you're fat, and you shouldn't be that fat. And the only way you're not going to be fat is to go on the start. So if you've got a roll, what we call the insulin roll, we're going to take away that insulin roll. We're going to take away 5, 6, 8, 10, 40 kilograms, 80 pounds of weight, and you're going to go hugely faster. So the best question is, I can improve a person's performance 100%, because before they weren't even on the bicycle, they were too fat to get on the bicycle. Now they get on the bicycle and they finish. So that's 100% improvement.
Right. So it's large. It even for athletes, though, you're going to see a 5-10% improvement in some people, because they can lose those extra 5-10 pounds or something like that.
Exactly. And that you take, let's take Chris Froome. Chris Froome goes on the start, and he's a competitive athlete coming in the 30 to 50 group of the world's best athletes, but he's 30th. And then he suddenly goes on the start and he wins. He comes second in the Tour of Italy, and then he wins the Tour de France.
Yeah.
So that's the difference for him. But that was the 8 kilograms he lost, and that made a hell of a difference for guys racing at the top of the performance spectrum.
Interesting.
But everyone writes to me, and they, by and large, even the average athlete improves their marathon time substantially, because, again, if you're running, you're carrying that weight with you, and you don't need to carry it with you.
Right.
And so on the same level of training, your performance goes up. It's kind of logical. Yeah.
Yep.
So a lot of the performance benefit is just simply losing the weight. It's not because you become metabolically different, but ultimately becoming metabolically different is going to help you in the long term, because you're not going to get diabetes. And it's not long before every second American has type 2 diabetes. That is not too far in the distance.
Okay. Well, cool. I can't thank you enough for being on the show. This was really interesting. I think people are going to love this episode because they've been asking about it a lot, ketogenic and Banting type diet. So thank you. Where can listeners learn more about you and your foundation?
Yeah, I think if they just check in at the Noakes Foundation, Google Noakes Foundation, and go to our website, it's not all about sport. It's actually about health for humans, and health particularly for poorer humans who can't afford decent food.
Good.
So that's our focus, rather than athletic performance. But there's a whole lot of information there. And then we run a nutrition network for doctors where we teach them how to prescribe this diet and for benefit of their patients. So those are some of our focuses of the Noakes Foundation.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure it's late there in South Africa, so have a great night, and we can't thank you enough.
Thanks, Chris. Lovely to chat to you.
Yeah, you too.
See you
Take
soon.
care. All right.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 26, where we discuss men's health and learn how saddle selection, urogenital health, and healthy levels of testosterone can help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flowcycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.